This is the Comics Alternative, episode 176, reviews of Renée and The Discipline #1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this week's episode, Andy and I are going to look at a couple of recent releases. We're going to start with the new book from Ludovic Debeurme, Renée. And then we're going to look at issue #1 of Peter Milligan and Leandro Fernandez's The Discipline. But before we get to those discussions, we want to let all of you listeners know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, including February, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials will be at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off, but often the discounts can get much more impressive than that.
That's right, and this month, as in every month, they have a load of bundles to take advantage of where you could get multiple comics from the same publisher at a deeper discount than you would get if you bought those comics individually. And so this month, they have bundles from Marvel, DC, and DC Vertigo, Valiant, and Aftershock, in which with Aftershock you can get the 3 new #1 Aftershock titles for 45% off. So that's $3.27 for all 3 of those comics.
Yeah, so now Aftershock has joined the noble ranks of bundles at Discount Comic Book Service.
Yep.
Yeah, and we're going to look at Aftershock titles in the very near future, but for now, you guys ought to head over to Discount Comic Book Service's website, dcbservice.com, because they'll take care of all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your bundles there, be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
And another visit that we would strongly recommend that you make is to go to the website of our other sponsor for this episode, and that is Just Coffee Co-op. It's a great place to get your coffee, tea, and chocolates. All of their coffee is 100% fair trade, shade-grown, and organic certified. What's more, everything is roasted to order. They do everything in small batches. There is no mass production whatsoever.
That's right, and so you enjoy comics, you enjoy coffee. Just Coffee Co-op is a great place to go, and you can feel good drinking their coffee because it all is responsible and for a good cause.
That's right. It's cooperatively owned, and if you go to their website, justcoffee.coop, that's justcoffee.coop, and place your order upon checkout, make sure that you use the coupon code COMICS. That'll not only give you 10% off of your order, but it will also help the Comics Alternative. So that's justcoffee.coop. Use the coupon code COMICS, and shipping is always free. That's Just Coffee Co-op. It's a great place to get caffeinated.
Yep.
So, Andy, it's been a while since you and I have done a show together. How have things been in your little part of the world?
It's been pretty good. I've been busy, and one of the things I've been busy on is planning out a comic show in Sumter, South Carolina that is a continuation of one I worked on last year. The local county cultural commission had some money last year that they wanted to put into doing a comic show, and it was a success, so they decided to do it again this year. And it's coming together. So it will be March 4th and 5th. So if anybody's in South Carolina or South Carolina area and want to come down to Sumter on March 4th at my school, the University of South Carolina, Sumter, I'm going to be doing a conversation with Erica Henderson and Kyle Starks from 2 to 3:30. So Erica Henderson, of course, artist on Squirrel Girl and Jughead, and Kyle Starks, the creator of the fantastic Sex Castle graphic novel, in which has recently been optioned for a movie, which I hope gets made, and also is the cause of me having to utter the phrase in meetings with local politicians and so on. This book is not about a building. It's one word.
Yeah.
And then on Saturday from 10 to 7, we're going to have a whole load of guests at that include Chris Schweitzer, the creator of the Krogan Adventure stuff, Sanford Green, who's doing the Power Man and Iron Fist comic for Marvel, which just came out and is fantastic. Chris Sims and Chad Bowers from X-Men 92. Babs Tarr, artist on Batgirl, and a bunch of other creators. I'm also going to be interviewing Roy Thomas at that show, which is something I've done before and is always fun to do.
Well, let's hope you can get a couple of interviews for the podcast out of that event.
Yeah, I'm hoping to at least record the conversation with Erica and Kyle on
Yeah, because you
Friday.
did that with Tim Seeley last year.
Yeah, yep.
That was good. Well, on the topic of conference events, there are a couple of others that you and I wanted to mention as well that are also coming up pretty darn soon. On the 8th through the 10th of April, the University of Florida, their English program, is having their annual conference on comics. And this year, the theme is Transnational Comics, Crossing Gutters, Transcending Boundaries. And if you're in the Gainesville, Florida area, you definitely want to check this out, because this is something that the grad students have been putting on there, those in the comic studies program, for quite a number of years. And I've been to this conference before. They do a great job of not only selecting wonderful presentations, papers, and guests, but also in making every attendee, the guests as well as presenters, feel very welcome.
Yeah, now you have a role in this, don't you?
Yeah, so I'm a little biased. I'm going to be one of their keynote speakers. So
Keynote.
Yep. So I'm
jealous.
Well,
I'm hoping the keynote someday.
Yeah. Well, I'm hoping. I've been a guest speaker a few times, but this is the first time I've been a keynote. So I hope I don't screw it up.
No, you'll be great.
Yeah.
You're a pro.
But anyway, that is, again, April 8th through 10th in Gainesville, Florida, at the University of Florida. So check that out.
Yeah, and then finally, and I will mention this again as we get closer to it, but another event I'm excited about that I'll be at is the International Comic Arts Forum Conference, which happens every 18 months or so, is taking place at the University of South Carolina in Columbia. So that's just an hour away from me. So I'll be going there on April 14th to 16th. I'll be involved. I'll be chairing a panel, not keynote speaking. That job goes to Michael Chaney, who's, a swell guy.
Yeah.
And the guests there include Howard Cruz, Keith Knight, Dominique Goblet, Sanford Green, Gary Jackson, Roy Thomas, and CeCe Bell. So that's going to, and it, plus an academic conference involved in it as well. So that's going to be good. And I like going to the comics conferences because I've developed a friendship with many of these people, the comic scholars, and I always have fun taking the opportunity to see these people.
Well, that sounds fun. I wish I were able to go this year.
Yeah.
So those are three events to watch out for in the next couple of months. Now, Andy, you and I need to get into a discussion of this week's titles. But before we do, let us mention real quick, remind our listeners, as I have over the past couple of weeks, we are doing a survey, and we want to know who you guys are that are listening to the podcast. And this is a very short, simple, to the point, straightforward survey. So it's not going to take, a great many moments out of your life. It should take no more than, let's say, a minute or two. And if you go to the website survey.libsyn.com/comicsalternative, you'll see how short it is. Now, again, that website is survey.libsyn, libsyn.com/comicsalternative. 6 very simple questions. And so take the time, answer those, let us know who you are, and you don't have to include your email address. But if you do include your email address, you'll be included in a drawing, because after we do this survey over the next month or two, then we will draw one name from those who have submitted an email address, who have taken the survey, and when we get our Comics Alternative official t-shirts printed up later this year, that lucky person will get one.
Yeah, that's exciting. That's a good giveaway.
Yep. But we do plan on printing those up this year, and I'm hoping we can do that in time for Heroes Con.
Yeah, I'm hopefully set to go for Heroes Con this year. Mm-hmm. It'll be a little different because I'm working in the summer and I don't normally work in the summers until I got this new administrative position. So I'm hoping to take that weekend off. Yeah,
well, if you do, then you can also wear a Comics Alternative t-shirt.
Yeah, well, I'm going to wear that to work.
Yeah, there you go. Wear it with pride, my friend. And again, that web address for the survey is survey.libsyn, libsyn.com/comicsalternative. So go there right now, take the survey, and you'll feel good about life.
Yeah.
So, Andy, you want to get to the books for this week?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, we're going to begin with the new book from Ludovic Debeurme, which is Renée, and this is published by Top Shelf. This is a follow-up to his 2011, at least in the U.S., book, mm-hmm. Lucille. Lucille was originally published in 2006 in France, but Top Shelf published an English edition in 2011. It's really interesting to look at Renée alongside Lucille. Mm-hmm. I don't know if we should begin talking about Renée within the context of Lucille or talk about it on its own. It seems a little difficult talking about it outside of the previous book.
Yeah, one of the things I was wondering that I wanted to ask you, because you hadn't read Lucille before, right?
I read it before I read Renée.
Yeah, but not before. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, not when it originally came out, though.
Yeah. But I was but I would be wondering if someone came to Renée without having read Lucille, would they be able to follow it? And I don't necessarily think it would be a problem.
That's a good question. I don't know, because now, having read Lucille before Renée, just mm-hmm. as you have, we're tainted now.
Yeah.
And so there's no way for us to go back in time unless all of a sudden we wiped our memories. and I'm not advocating for that. But there's no way of experiencing that. I would think that it would be graspable, but at the same time, I think that readers may be losing out on a number of things. In other words, it would take them longer to get their narrative sea legs with what's going on in Renée without having read Lucille.
Yeah. So for those who are unfamiliar with either of these, Lucille mainly focuses on the character Lucille and
Arthur.
A young man who becomes her boyfriend, Arthur, and both of them return to the story in Renee. And so one of the main things people wouldn't be getting is their backstory. At the beginning of Renee, Arthur's in prison. He's in prison for a crime that he committed in Lucille. Lucille is living with her mother and kind of waiting for Arthur to get released. And there's allusions to her eating disorder. That is a major part of the plot of Lucille. So those two things, so it may be, you said getting narrative sea legs. It also may be the kind of emotional impact of Lucille and Arthur's relationship. The sacrifice Arthur made for her and why she's waiting for him wouldn't necessarily be as emotionally charged as one might get if they've read Lucille. And on top of that, too, there's Arthur's family relationship, specifically this kind of cycle that his father and grandfather went through in their lives that Arthur had hoped to resist. Right. That his father and grandfather's death doesn't get even really mentioned in Renee at all. So how his childhood and his life with his father impacts him while he's in prison in Renee doesn't get addressed.
Right. Now, on the topic of Arthur and his family, which we get quite extensively in that earlier book, Lucille, that you mentioned. And again, we're not doing spoilers here. We don't know exactly what happens with Arthur at the end of Renee. However, if you know about the backstory of Arthur, his father, and then the family, the men in the family in this kind of cycle that you mentioned, then I think that there is a clearer way or a more determined way of reading the ending, or a possible way of reading the ending of Renee. And this is one of those several examples, I think. Without having read Renee, you could enjoy and appreciate to some degree, or without having read Lucille, you could enjoy and appreciate to some degree Renee, but there's a lot that you would miss out on. And I think that whatever may happen, and we don't know, even those of us who have read Lucille don't know exactly what has happened to Arthur at the very end of this recent book. Knowing what happens in Lucille and his family context does go a long way. Now, it's not mentioned, unless I missed it somewhere, in Renee, but the reason why Arthur is in prison, would it be a spoiler for us to mention what happened toward the end of Lucille, the previous book?
Well, I don't know. He's basically, we could say he's in prison, a crime basically that he committed while protecting Lucille.
Right. So let's just say that Arthur committed a crime in protecting Lucille, and we can leave it at that. And it's enough of a crime to land him in jail. And we don't get detail about the crime he committed in Renee. And again, that's another reason why I think having read Lucille would give you a lot to work with in understanding what's going on in Renee. But one of the things that makes Renee strikingly different from the previous book is, as you mentioned, we have the characters Lucille and Arthur, but then there's a third main character, Renee. Bruzenet, I believe is her last name, if that's how you pronounce it. And she becomes a major part of this narrative. She was nowhere in the earlier book.
Right, and Renee's main plot involves her and her affair with a man named Pierre, who we know is at least attached to another person, if not married to another person.
Right.
He does say, "I'm living with somebody," but I don't know if he ever says that she's his wife.
Yeah, I don't think that's made clear one way or the other.
Right. And Renee has, in the previous book, we got Lucille's body image issues and her anorexia. And in Renee has also her own body issues. She cuts herself, and she also has an unconventional, I guess, sexual relationship with Pierre.
Mm-hmm. Which, and I'm glad that you mentioned this, because this is just one of several parallels that we can see, not just between Lucille, the book, and Renee, the book, but between the characters Renee and Pierre and their relationship, and then Lucille and Arthur's relationship. Also, another parallel between Lucille's relationship with her family, Arthur's relationship with his family, Renee's relationship with her family, because both Renee and Lucille, as well as Arthur, all three of these main characters, who are the three protagonists in this latest book, they have father issues, and they're all different. Right. Arthur's is much more pronounced, and we may not see it in Renee, but we definitely see it, as we mentioned, in that earlier book. With Lucille, the character, and Renee, the character, we do get to see some of their parental issues, especially when it comes to the father, but also the mother as well. And so I think those two characters kind of parallel, mirror, or reflect the other. So, there's one of the things that Debeurme is doing is he's showing some thematic similarities between the characters in these two books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a good point, and that reminded me of how, in reading both of these books, first in reading Lucille, you get the parallel narratives of Lucille and Arthur's lives. And when I first read that, I was wondering how are these two going to come together? Mm-hmm. And there was something similar going on in Renee, but this time with Lucille and Renee. Other than the kind of thematic and experiential parallels between Lucille and Renee, how are those characters' narratives going to come together? And I found that also to be, and that may be even an even bigger spoiler than anything else we've been trying to avoid, but that I found very fulfilling.
Yeah, exactly. And again, without giving away any detail, how Renee and Lucille, these characters, are brought together is actually something that happens with Arthur while he's in prison. So all three of the characters are central in terms of bringing the Lucille storyline and the Renee storylines together toward the end of this book. And I have a sense that the way that Renee, the book, it's kind of awkward talking about books that are titled after protagonists, because when we say Renee and Lucille, are we talking about the characters of the book?
You should say it in italics when you're talking about the books.
Okay, that's what I will do then. So Renee, use a different tone of voice when we're talking in italics. But Renee ends in such a way that I just expect there to be a third book in this series.
That's interesting that you said that, because I was wondering the same thing too, but let me see if I can find it. Maybe I'm wrong. Actually, I can't find the ending. Oh yeah, no. The end of Lucille, I have this one in print. Says end of part 1. The end of Renee just says, fiend, right. End. So you're right. There's definitely more story to tell at the end of Renee. I just wonder if that's actually going to happen.
That's a good point. I hadn't thought about the way that Renee ends with the fin. That does seem to be some kind of conclusion. So maybe this is just a 2-part larger story. The books, Lucille and Renee. who knows? But things end in such a way that Debeurme could easily carry this on into a third volume.
Yes.
Yeah. And I hope he does, because even though I do think that this is a satisfying ending, and I'm okay with ambiguous and equivocal endings. I prefer those in my narratives. It would be nice to see what is going to happen with the characters Lucille and Renee and where they're going. I would also like to see a little more information about what happens to Arthur, or what may have happened.
Yeah, that's. I feel less uncertain about that than it sounds like you do. But I don't know how much I want to go into that.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I'm uncertain. I have a particular reading, but I don't want to. And I think we're probably on the same page, so to speak. But we can't say anything because it would give some parts of this recent book away.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, I do read it in a particular way. I mean, for me, we don't know exactly for certain what happens to Arthur. I have a pretty good idea what does, though.
Now, when we saw this Renee show up in the previews catalog, when we were doing the previews episode, I was really excited about it because I had read Lucille and really liked Lucille, but you came fresh to Lucille with this, and so in going back and rereading Lucille, I was realizing just that not just that I liked this book, but I would put this in the Lucille in the top ranks of my favorite graphic novels of all time, mainly because of there's a kind of pure emotional punch to it. There's a way that it gets a certain kind of teenage angst that both Lucille and Arthur have, how they kind of find each other and know how to take care of one another,
right?
In a way that their parents, can't see, and all of that stuff is just so well done in that book. But also, the term that came to mind for me over and over again in rereading this was just how kind of pure and emotional experience that book is.
Right. I would say the word punk comes to mind.
Sure. Yeah.
In describing the book Lucille.
Yeah. And opening Renee and getting into Renee, even though we're following the same characters, Renee is somewhat of a different book. For one thing, Debeurme's art style has changed dramatically. In the first book, his art style is much more kind of iconic and simple.
Right.
It actually kind of reminded me, when I reread it this time, of Chester Brown's art.
I'm glad that you mentioned that. They're in reading through not just Lucille, but also looking at Renee, I'm reminded of not only Chester Brown, but also in places, Jules Feiffer.
I never saw Jules Feiffer in Renee.
Lucille, though.
Yeah. I guess that's true, especially in the kind of loose line drawing that he uses in that. In Renee, I was seeing it looks like Debeurme's moved into something closer to what I got is a combination of Dan Clowes and Charles Burns.
I agree, yeah.
Charles Burns, especially in some of the body stuff. Renee cuts herself, for example, and this little boy who factors into many instances in the book and is a kind of mysterious figure that we don't necessarily know who he is, but towards the end we can get kind of a hint of who he is.
Right.
But this little boy crawls out of the cut. Another girl crawls out. Worms come out of it, and I was like, this is the kind of thing Charles Burns does. But the art style, as opposed to in the kind of iconic, simple style in Lucille, Debeurme is using a lot more cross-hatching in this. There's a lot more detail.
Much more texture.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. More texture. Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the things I wanted to mention and for us to discuss is some of the differences between these two books, between the book Lucille and then the book Renee, which just recently came out. And one is a difference in art style. Now, there are parts of the recent book where the art is like hearkening back to the majority, if not almost all, of the art style that we see in the earlier book. But especially in the first half of Renee, there are examples, many examples, of what you were just describing, this much more detailed, more textured art that has that feel of, and I like the way that you put it, kind of a cross between both Charles Burns and Daniel Clowes. There is something like that, especially when Debeurme gives us a close-up of a particular character. Sometimes it's a major, but many times it's a minor character, and we see them in portrait.
Yeah,
and so that it's a way of establishing character, right? So it's kind of a character exposition, if you want to look at it that way. And so there are differences in art style between the two books. Another difference between this recent book and the earlier one is I felt that Renee is more surreal in places and dreamlike. And one great example of that is what you had mentioned, the scene where we get the cuts on Renee's arm and this boy crawls out of that. I mean, but there are other examples of things that are a little more surreal. Now, there were somewhat surreal, dreamlike images in the earlier book, Lucille, but not near as prominent and strange as we get in the recent book. Also, there are times in Renee that there are pages or maybe parts of pages, some of the art, and we ought to mention that part of Debeurme's style in both of these books is we have panelless or borderless panels.
Right.
Now, sometimes a panel really is nothing more than a page, but if you have more than what we would normally call panels, more than one of those on a page, then there are no borders, and sometimes the images or the panels kind of meld one into the other. There are places where on some of these pages, some of the art looks more like sketches, and I think this leads back to my surreal, dreamlike comment. Yeah. It's almost as if we're momentarily taken out of the story that's going on, the storyline that we're in, whether it be a Renee storyline or a Lucille or an Arthur storyline, with a couple of sketches or illustrations that may or may not have anything directly to do with the story. And so it's kind of a different reading experience.
Yeah, that's true. And you know, in looking back through Lucille momentarily, it feels like any of the kind of dreamlike moments in it are clearly identified as dreams. You know, somebody we get, you know, characters turning into bees and things like that, but the someone wakes up at the end of that.
Right.
That part. Whereas in Lucille, or excuse me, in Renee, you know, people's faces will start elongating, their legs will stretch out, and other deformities happen that we're not really sure where that is taking place in terms of kind of consciousness.
Exactly.
And then what else was? And I think there's more. In general, there's more grotesquerie in Renee. There is, and I think one of the biggest issues is that little boy that keeps popping up. What realm?
Boy.
Yeah, what realm does he function in? Is he a dream, a hallucination, a flashback, or is he just, you know, a creepy little boy who's following everybody around?
Yeah, or a narrative device that Debeurme is using to inject for different reasons. And I don't know if we want to give away who we think this little boy may be. I mean, I'm pretty sure who it is, but but we'll just leave it out there because toward the end of the book, as you pointed out, there is a conversation between the characters Lucille and Renee where Renee mentions something about a kind of boy, we know that this is who she's referring to. I think.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure I know that this is the character.
Right.
But we won't give away who that is. And so I look at the appearance of this creepy little boy, if we want to call him that, as more of a narrative device than as a hallucination that a character may be having at one point.
Right.
Yeah.
I agree. One of the things that I really loved about Lucille that I'm glad comes back in Renée is Debeurme's use of silence. These are long books. Each one is almost 500 pages, and yet there are very, very long silent passages in each of these books, in which the reader kind of gets again absorbed into the world that these characters inhabit.
And that gets back to something that you've mentioned a couple times earlier, and that is the emotional pull for these books. And I think much of that emotional impact is drawn out through these moments of silence or the lack of action, where we have more of, let's say, what McLeod would call an aspect-to-aspect transition.
Yeah, and I think what that really highlights, and this is true in each book, how certain kind of momentary impulsive decisions on characters' parts break out of that, that stillness and have devastating impacts on people's lives. I really feel like that the emotional punches of both of these books are as much dependent on not just the images and the moments themselves, but the pacing up until those moments, and especially the long kind of silent passages where we do really get absorbed into these characters.
Exactly. Another thing I wanted to mention in terms of a difference between these books, and this gets back to an earlier comment you made regarding Lucille, that there are quite a number of illustrations where characters, many times Lucille and Arthur, are represented as insects of one form or another. And we do get that in this current book, Renée, every now and again, but not near with the frequency that we find in the book Lucille. Now, this brings me to a difference in terms of the two books' structures. One big difference between Lucille and then Renée is, I think Lucille, the earlier book, is a much more tightly constructed narrative. And that is, there are clear chapter divisions throughout. And you're at almost no time are you unclear or uncertain that you're in a new chapter, which is definitely not the case at times in Renée.
Right.
Another way that the earlier book, Lucille, is structured, you have basically the two stories of Lucille and then Arthur in their lives. And for the first half of that book, almost exactly the first half, the two stories of each of their lives are completely separate. And you will have a chapter on Lucille, then a chapter on Arthur, then a chapter of Lucille, then a chapter on Arthur. Go back and forth, back and forth. Around the middle, almost the exact middle of the book, their stories come together in a really interesting way. And then after that, their stories are closely intertwined, so you don't have a back and forth between these two characters. In the second half of Lucille, you still have a series of one chapter following another in a clear sequential manner, but they're the story of not Lucille or Arthur, but Lucille and Arthur. Now, with the recent book, Renée, things are much looser, and I think loose is a good way of describing the way that this book is presented to us in terms of the storyline. And I went through, there are, I guess, 4 parts of this book that you could, I think, conceivably call chapters. The first part of this book, up to page, now we're looking at PDFs, up to page 158 on my PDF, has no chapter title. So I don't know what to call it. I just call it the first part. And then after that, there are 3 chapters or 3 sections that have titles. There's Rupture, that begins on page 158, or the PDF, that page. And then the next one following that, not quite 100 pages after, is Fenster. And then the final section of the book is called Minor Land. And, I think that if those last 3 sections with the titles Rupture, Fenster, and Minor Land, if those titles were removed, I don't think that it would have done anything or changed the narrative in any way whatsoever in my understanding of things. So and that's what I mean by loose, right? This first part of the book, up into the first 150 some pages, it just seems to be one character's story, one protagonist's narrative, Arthur, Lucille, or Renee, and their relationships, kind of folding or melding one into the other in a very unstructured way, almost dreamlike way. But then the rest of Renee, even though you may have chapter titles, if we want to call them that, or section titles, I don't know if necessarily those chapter or section titles are clear demarcations that we're going from one part to another, like we had in the earlier book, Lucille. Right.
I wonder I wonder if that's an indication of some kind of change in, or development in Debeurme's narrative style, and structure that maybe in this newer book it's much more fluid and therefore may not need chapter titles, and yet there are still those that kind of survive, maybe who knows, out of habit or whatever, but or that in some of those places, like the one for I'm having a hard time scrolling through this. The one for Rupture, for example, that there is this moment in which we're not seeing any characters from the book that we've seen before in those pages. There are these kind of profiles of people,
right,
and becoming increasingly grotesque and deformed, and then it kind of flows into a moment with Pierre. But I wonder if the rupture itself isn't so much, maybe, I mean, it could be describing the chapter, because this is where we find out how Renee met Pierre. But also the rupture being this moment that is kind of out of context.
It's a narrative rupture.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in fact, to come back to your earlier comment about Klaus and Burns, this is the best example of a Klaus and Burns rupture, I guess, in Debeurme's narrative that we have. It's at that part, because you look at the characters that you had mentioned, people on the street, and many of them look like the kind of almost grotesque figures that we get in Daniel Klaus stories.
Yes.
But then things seem to get a little weird and dreamlike or surreal, where characters' bodies start taking on these weirder forms, and I think that's the Charles Burns part coming into play here, if we want to call it that. That's very interesting. This part of the book, and and I think this loose structuring of Renee goes hand in hand with the more dreamlike, surreal aspect of the stories that we get, Lucille's stories, Arthur's, and then Renee's.
Yeah, exactly. When I was first reading through Renee, and I ended up reading Renee twice, my first feeling right away was, oh, this is not nearly as good as Lucille. But once I got through it and started to see how the different narrative lines paid off, how the Lucille and Renee in particular came together, what Arthur's experiences in prison were like, it worked for me better once I got to the end. And so in rereading it again, And then again, also rereading it to start to pick up on some of the elements that are kind of mysterious through much of the book, was also paid off. So, while I do think in the end Lucille may be the superior book, I think that Renee is definitely a solid and effective follow-up.
Yeah, because I was going to ask you if what you said earlier, Lucille is one of your favorite books of all time when it comes to graphic novels or comics, then how would Renee stack up in comparison to that? And you're saying that maybe not as much, but still a very powerful text.
Yeah, it's not like, it's not like a Phantom Menace or something.
Right.
where it ruin almost, has the potential to ruin the earlier film.
Right. So maybe Renee is to Lucille like, I don't know, Daniel Boring is to Ghost World.
Yeah, maybe, because I still like Daniel Boring quite a bit.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Right.
I mean,
but it's not Ghost World. Right.
Right.
Yeah. That makes sense. That's a good comparison.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm the same way. I like both books. I really like Renee, and I liked it the first time I read it, but I had the same experience going back to reread it because I did the same. I got a better sense of things, and experience you have every time you read a text more than once. You come to appreciate it more. But because this one, Renee, is so loosely constructed, and I keep coming back to this word loose.
Yeah.
Going back and rereading it really did help because I could see more of what Debeurme's project is in Renee.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I have a better appreciation for it. I mean, I think that Lucille is a book that I enjoyed more than I did Renee, but Renee is one that, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 more readings I could come to appreciate it even more. I mean, as much as I like it now. But still, I think I could like it better. It's just that Lucille, because it was more tightly constructed and more immediately accessible, I think. I tended to have a more discernible enjoyment when it comes to the reading experience than with Renee. Renee was a little more work to appreciate, I think.
Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. I agree with that. But I think the work is worthwhile.
Definitely.
Yeah. And I feel like I will, I'll return to both of these books as I go along, because I do think that they are, they're the kind of books too that I would feel like giving to somebody. I almost wish I had access to something like Lucille when I was a teenager, because part of reading that reading experience reminded me of those kind of teenage experience of reading something like The Catcher in the Rye, for example.
Yeah.
At 14 or 15, and feeling like, this is it. This is explaining for me what my experience is like being, I don't know, a rich kid in a prep school. Well, that wasn't me.
When an Andy catches an Andy coming down the road.
Yeah, there you go. But the Lucille, the idea of being a kind of disaffected teenager whose parents don't seem to understand, who are trying to force the what they feel is the best options for their children, and ultimately don't know what the children really need. And Arthur and Lucille finding each other and being able to take care of each other is powerful. And I think it would be even more powerful for someone who's a teenager who may be even going through some of those kinds of alienating experiences.
Oh, yeah. Now I've never taught Lucille, but I could conceivably teach. I mean, I would want to teach Lucille in what I was. Have you ever taught Lucille?
No.
Okay. I would think that this would be a great book to pair with Blankets.
Yeah.
and maybe even Fun Home. I've taught Fun Home and Blankets together back to back, and I think they worked really well together, even though I think it gave my students whiplash.
Yeah.
But I think throwing this one into the mix would be great for kind of a comics-themed class.
Mm-hmm.
Growing up, coming to terms.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it would also be nice to do that because you would like have students go into the bookstore. They would see Blankets at whatever 600 plus pages. They would see Lucille at almost 500 pages, and they'd go, to hell with this class. And you'd have like 4 students in the class, and that would be awesome.
Less to grade.
Yeah, exactly.
But I don't know if I would ever teach Renée by itself without first having students read Lucille.
Right. Yeah, Lucille too seems, now that you mentioned asking teaching, I never thought about teaching it, but it's a really teachable book also, just because of some of the things you mentioned in terms of the borderless panels, the way Debeurme constructs word balloons and text. How text functions visually. There's so many things that are part of the unique poetics of comics that are on display in Lucille that would make it really teachable and make it cover a lot of it would be an efficient book even in its length to be able to cover a lot of different aspects of comics as a medium too.
Boy, now I want to teach it.
Yeah,
we've talked
there
about
you go.
This.
Me too.
Well, before we can teach those books, we probably need to take a break and rest up a bit. And what better way of taking a break than with a great cup of coffee you can get from one of our sponsors for this episode, and that is Just Coffee Co-op. Remember, they have coffee, tea, and chocolates. Everything is fair trade, organic certified. And if you go to their website, justcoffee.coop, you can find a wide variety of coffees, put them into your shopping basket, and then when you check out, make sure you use our coupon code COMICS. That'll give you 10% off your order.
Yeah, that's right. And since I started this administrative position, I have to be at work from like 8:30 to 5 o'clock every day. And I usually make my way through 3 cups of Just Coffee Co-op coffee every day. And so I enjoy it quite a bit. It's good stuff.
Wow. You could be a testimonial for Just Coffee Co-op. My name is Andy. I'm a department chair. I have long days. One of the things that gets me through those days is Just Coffee Co-op.
Yep. Is my crippling addiction to caffeine. No, that's not a good sales pitch. I'm terrible at that.
Well, let's move on to the second title that we're going to be discussing, and this is issue number 1 of The Discipline, written by Peter Milligan with art by Leandro Fernandez. And the first issue will come out on March 2nd, but we're going to talk about it a couple weeks ahead of time to kind of whet your appetites, dear listener, of what to expect. Now, Andy, I know you're a big Peter Milligan fan. I like Peter Milligan as well, but I know you're a gigantic Peter Milligan fan.
I don't know about gigantic. For example, I never actually finished Peter Milligan and Leandro Fernandez's last collaboration, The Names. I was waiting for that to come out in trade, and it has since come out in trade, and I haven't grabbed that yet. But I did read the first 4 issues, and so the 2 of them are working together again on this Image title.
Yeah. No, The Names. We talked about issue number 1 on the podcast, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so here we have not a Vertigo, but an Image title.
Mm-hmm. And both books have a female protagonist, which may be part of what is working with their collaboration.
Yeah. Although this one is a lot more sexed up than The Names.
Yeah, this this book is more in keeping for those people who are Peter Milligan fans and go back a little bit to something like The Extremist, Peter Milligan's collaboration with Ted McKeever. That was a very early Vertigo book that deals with a kind of darker side to sexuality, getting more into the kind of BDSM side of things.
Mm-hmm. And when I guess it was 2 months ago that we saw the solicit in the previews catalog, and we were discussing this. This darker side of sex, the BDSM side, it was definitely hinted at and presented in the sample pages in previews. But there was a part of this first issue that, from what I can remember, was not represented or hinted at in any way. And that kind of threw me in getting into this first issue of The Discipline. And that is this, what do we call it? This kind of otherworldly, almost mythological angle that the story takes. And we get a little bit of this in the opening pages, but this becomes a little clearer, not completely clear, but it becomes a little more clear as we get to the very end of this first issue.
Yeah, and so we have the main character, Melissa, who is a woman who's she's married to a millionaire, and but she's very dissatisfied with her life, especially on an emotional and sexual level. She's also got a sister who she's at odds with over the care of their mother, and Melissa is basically confronted by a man named Orlando while they're standing in front of a famous Goya painting of what's the title of the painting? Venus Satyr, yeah.
Satyr, yeah.
And she becomes intrigued by him, and they start an affair. But what we discover is, especially as one of the things that Orlando says, that it isn't about sex. It's about something else. But sex is a pathway towards whatever it is they're going to be doing.
Right. And this is one of the pages that was actually included in the preview solicit, where we see toward the beginning of this first issue Melissa jogging with her dog, whose name is Hemingway. And we can see that she is sexually unsatisfied. And there's something about, I guess, the aura she gives off, the way that she looks, that draws Orlando, because when he sees her running by, he's looking at her, and he kind of summarizes her, and this is just a few pages in. He says, Melissa Peake, 23 years old, clever but sexually and emotionally unfulfilled, just as the council like them. Okay, so who's this council? What is he referring to? Okay, well, we may find out a little bit more later. Oh, yes, she has potential. And, and then on the next page, we see her standing in front of this Goya painting, very sexual, and that's when she actually does meet face-to-face Orlando. He approaches her, and after saying that we will meet again in 2 days, he grabs her crotch.
Yeah. So they meet face-to-face and hand to crotch.
Exactly.
But one of that leads to one of the things about this book that is interesting, and that I think Milligan does well in other works too, which is treating sex and sexuality in a more mature and straightforward way. There's a point in which, for example, Melissa says, well, part of this experience with Orlando starts to kind of inhabit her dreams, and she wakes up from a particularly erotic dream and masturbates. But the way she describes it is, I did that thing that we girls do sometimes. And I felt like that expression of it, even though it's kind of a euphemism, it is acknowledging the fact that people are sexual,
right,
and not in a wink wink nudge nudge sort of way.
Yeah, when I read that, when she says, "I did that thing that we girls do sometime," my immediate reaction was just come out and say it instead of masking it. But well,
but I like that the phrasing makes it seem like a normal thing rather than
it does
the kind of oh well.
Okay, what kind of voice was that?
I don't know. Oh my.
Oh yeah,
is that my George Takei?
Yeah.
I think at first it was more like kind of, I don't know.
George Takei and Ed Wynn.
Yeah, Ed Wynn at the Peep Show. Hello. Which I'm sure happened in real life.
Yeah. But yeah, and also that phrase, I did the things that we girls do sometimes, it also classes it up a little bit, right?
Sure. Yeah. And so, but speaking of that too, now Peter Milligan's also dealing in a way with sexuality in New Romancer as well right now from Vertigo.
Mm-hmm.
And,
which we discussed not too long ago.
Exactly. And I'm wondering with the discipline, especially with the discipline's kind of overt title, if this isn't in some way Peter Milligan's response to the popularity of something like 50 Shades of Grey, where it gets into this, this whole idea of discipline and bondage and so on, but in such a I don't know, well, just basically terrible book, but immensely popular.
Mm-hmm.
And Milligan, I don't know if Milligan's responding to that in that he's kind of, since he's already had works that have delved into that area, seeing something in the zeitgeist now to explore this further, or if this is almost a response to that, to say let's take this idea that clearly has some kind of traction in amongst readers right now, and do something actually interesting with it.
Right. And this is very interesting. And this is from the first issue, from what we have,
mm-hmm.
It seems to be a very sexual title, but not sexual in an explicit way. In other words, this is not Black Kiss. By any means,
mm-hmm.
but it's much more of a sensual work.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by that, there are scenes where the sex is also mixed in or woven into violence and flesh, mm-hmm. because there's one scene about halfway through where Orlando, I guess this is their first date, Orlando takes Melissa to, I guess, a slaughterhouse, and they're looking at a cow that is up on a hook and hanging from the ceiling, and blood is dripping from its throat because, it's been slaughtered.
Mm-hmm.
And then we see on that next page, she has, I guess, a vision of herself being hung upside down with her hands bound. And so there's definitely something bondage-like going on here, but she's bleeding, and just like that cow was. And so, I mean, there's a lot of liquid going on here. So, yeah. So, that also gets to what I was saying about this is a very sensual book, right? And not necessarily in just a sexual, but also a potentially violent way. Or not potentially violent way, because we have images of rape, and even other forms of violence as we get toward the end of this issue.
Yeah, and I think that part of what that sensuality comes through in Leandro Fernandez's art, and I do get a sense, the fact that that Milligan has continued to collaborate with Fernandez, I also see in this, and more so than in the I think 4 issues of the names I read, that Milligan is tapping into Fernandez's strengths here.
Yes. And I'm wondering if this is going to be a relationship similar to that between Brian Azzarello and, who worked with him on 100 Bullets?
Eduardo Risso.
Risso, yes. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because, those two have worked together on different projects. But Fernandez's art reminds me somewhat of Risso's.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think that's readily apparent right on the surface.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Now, the part about this title this first issue that gets not confusing to me, but I guess starts to tease out into a different direction, at least a different direction than I expected when I first picked up this book, is toward the end where we have some kind of potential transformation of Orlando. Now, we got a little hint of this in the opening pages of this first issue, but it becomes much more clear at the end. Let me ask you both a more pointed and a broader question. Do you think that the way that this first issue ends with this kind of other creaturely angle of the story, that it was handled well? And then the larger question is, do you feel that this is a number one issue that poses questions in a good way and it's satisfying in terms of its story? In other words, it makes you anticipate the next issue, but you feel that you get enough in order to grasp onto what's going on?
Yeah, I think it's the latter, because I think one of the turning points for me in the issue was the point in which Orlando says, that this is not about sex, or not just, or that that's just a means to an end. I don't have the exact quote, but that, along with the other hints that, for example, when Orlando talks about Goya, he talks about Goya like he knew him personally, and he talks about Leonardo da Vinci the same way. That if this book ends up being about this kind of theme of sex in the history of art, and the role that maybe this kind of secret organization has played in that history, I find that really interesting. So I'm hoping that those seeds that are planted like that I'm picking up are the things that end up being the kind of main themes of the series. If that's the case, then yeah, I feel like this is a good first issue that makes me anticipate and want to read more and find out more about these mysteries.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think this is a very satisfying first issue. And I actually ask you that question for a couple of reasons. One, just to ask your take on this specific first issue. But another reason I ask is, over the past couple of weeks, we have discussed other number one issues from Image. In particular, Mirror and Cry Havoc. And in both cases, I felt that, not that they were incomplete first issues, but they were first issues that left me with more questions than I would have liked. Now, I like for there to be questions, but I just felt that there needed to be a little more exposition or just something before we get to the end of that very first installment. And with both of those, especially with the Mirror, I just wanted there to be a little more. And I was wondering, in picking up Discipline number one, if I would have the same experience. It's like, oh God, I hope this is not a string of number one issues from Image. But no, this one I felt very satisfied by.
That's good. One of the things, when you asked me that question too, and some of the things you mentioned beforehand made me realize something I hadn't quite caught when I was reading it, which is that I think maybe the experience of reading the book would have been different if that opening scene weren't there, which I guess is a flash forward to something that's going to happen later.
Right.
And because, we see both Melissa and Orlando in these, not just having sex, but in these stages of transformation. That adds that level of supernatural element is apparent then from the first 2-3 pages. So that if the ending, if that hadn't been there, and we get to the ending when this, creature crashes through the window and attacks Orlando and Melissa, that would be a little too sudden of a change,
right?
Like a
storytelling
whiplash change. Yeah, and that since we're already anticipating the fact that there is a supernatural element to this story, it doesn't become shocking.
Yeah, I agree totally. I really like this first issue, and this is one. Now, is this going to be? Well, I guess we have no way of knowing, because this Image, they're notorious at not telling us if something is going to be a limited series, and I guess for a reason. I wonder how long this story is going to be, but I want to keep up with this. Yeah,
and one of the things we often talk about in terms of first issues too is, and this is the sense I get when you're talking about Cry Havoc and The Mirror, is that there seems to be some first issues that are designed to be simply the first chapter of a collection.
Right.
And so that you don't have, they may not be hooking you into buying the next issue, but maybe, the sixth issue hooks you into buying the next trade or something like that.
Exactly. And with this one, I don't feel like I want to automatically wait for the trade.
Exactly.
Yeah. Whereas with Mirror and Cry Havoc, I read those first issues, and I liked them well enough, but my ultimate response is, I like it, I want to go on to read it, I'll wait for the trade. The Discipline, though, I like it, I want to continue reading it in single issues.
Yeah, especially if it continues to tease out this mystery as it's been going. Now I'm trying to look up to see if there's any indication if it has been listed as a mini-series or not, but I'm going through a lot of stuff.
Yeah, and I don't think so, because Image...
No, it hasn't.
It doesn't usually do that. Now, Vertigo does.
Right.
Now, they may change the numbering. So what may start off as, let's say, a 12-issue limited may turn into an 8. But Image doesn't. And this is interesting. Last year, I guess it was back in December, when I interviewed Ed Brisson, I was asking him about this phenomena at Image. And he explained to me that, that's something that creators tend to do, or at least from his end, something that he likes to do, because he doesn't want people to, obviously to wait for the trade, because it doesn't help him financially. So I can see why artists and publishers don't let you know how many issues are in a limited series, or if something is indeed a limited series. I can understand that. I don't necessarily like it, but that's the way it is.
Yep.
Two enthusiastic recommendations for this week from both of us. We started off with the new book from Ludovic, Debeurme, Renée, and then we looked at Peter Milligan and Leandro Fernandez's The Discipline #1. I like both, and you do too.
Yes, right? Absolutely.
So, we have a great time talking about great titles, and if you guys want to find great titles, then you would do well to check out the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. If you go to their website, dcbservice.com, you're going to find unbelievable specials. Every single month, you will not be let down. And also something to check out, as we told you at the top of the show, is our survey. Remember that? Go to survey.libsyn, libsyn.com/comics alternative. It'll take just about a minute out of your life, and we appreciate the input. We want to know who you guys are that are listening to us.
Yeah, please give us some information on you.
Yeah, and we will not use it for any nefarious purposes, we promise.
No.
Yeah. That we know of yet. Yeah. Yeah, and after you do go to dcbservice.com and you take our survey, not necessarily in that order, then get in touch with us and let us know that, you're listening to us and you're, filling out the survey. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see that you can leave us a voice message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple and easy to use. Or you can call us over the telephone. The phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are 2guys@comicsalternative.com. Or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we also have our Twitter feed where we announce new content to the podcast as well as updates to the blog. You can check out our Twitter feed at the number 2 Guys with PhDs.
That's right. You can also find us elsewhere in the social media world, such as Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And you can find, as always, every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at the website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us. Let us know how we're doing, and let us know how you're doing, too.
Yeah, because we care.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, we may just change our tagline from 2 Guys with PhDs talking about comics to We Care.
Or 2 Guys with PhDs who care.
That's right.
How about split the difference?
Okay. Or 2 Guys with PhDs who care about comics, and maybe you.
And maybe you. Okay.
Okay, so we'll contemplate that change. In the meantime, you guys take care. See you next time. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.